The wolf saved the child in the snow, but its identity shocked everyone. It was a bitterly cold winter day, and the snow had been falling relentlessly for hours. In the remote town of Wintervale, the world was covered in a thick blanket of white, with trees bowed low under the weight of the snow, and the air was sharp with the scent of frozen earth. No one had expected the storm to grow this fierce, but when young Sophie, only 7 years old, decided to venture out into the woods near her home, the storm was already too strong. Sophie had always been curious about the world around her. Despite her parents' repeated warnings not to stray too far, her adventurous spirit often led her to ignore their caution. She had slipped away from the warmth of the house that afternoon, her heart full of excitement. The wind was howling, and the sky had begun to darken by the time she set out, but Sophie wasn't bothered. She loved exploring the woods, especially during the winter months when the trees stood like silent sentinels against the gray sky, their bare limbs casting long shadows in the snow. She had been out many times before, always feeling safe with the familiar sights of home just within reach. But this time, the snow felt different. The air was colder, heavier. It weighed down her small body, and the ground was softer, as if the snow was inviting her to venture deeper. The storm grew stronger. The wind picked up with an almost menacing force, whipping the snow into thick, swirling sheets that made it nearly impossible to see. The once soft blanket of snow became a harsh, blinding wall, the trees around her blurring into dark, shapeless shadows. Sophie's legs felt heavier with each step as the snow piled up, threatening to swallow her small form. She could hardly keep up, the snow seeping into her boots, the cold seeping into her bones. Soon, she realized she was lost. The trail she had been following had disappeared under the snow. Panic began to rise in her chest, sharp and sudden. She called out, but her voice was lost to the wind. The world felt vast and suffocating, the cold pressing in from all sides. She was alone. The thought struck her like a heavy weight, and her heart pounded with the dawning realization of how far she had strayed. But just as Sophie's breath hitched with panic, something shifted in the storm. A dark shape emerged from the swirling white, large and swift. Sophie blinked, trying to clear the frost from her eyes. As the figure drew closer, she could make out the shape of a wolf, a massive, silver-gray creature with fur matted from the storm. Its eyes glowed like shards of ice, intense and unblinking as it approached her. For a moment, Sophie froze, terror gripping her heart. She had heard stories of wolves and their savage ways. She knew they were dangerous. She had never imagined that one would be so close. But the wolf didn't lunge at her, didn't growl or show its teeth. Instead, it circled her slowly, its eyes never leaving hers. The creature's posture was different from anything Sophie had expected. It wasn't aggressive, but oddly calm, almost protective. Sophie stood still, hardly daring to breathe, unsure of what to do. The cold of the snow seemed to seep even deeper into her skin, and her legs trembled beneath her. The wolf seemed to study her for a long moment, its gaze unwavering. Then, to Sophie's surprise, it lowered its head as if inspecting her, sniffing the air around her. After a tense moment, it made a soft, almost soothing whine, a sound that seemed to cut through the blizzard's fury. Sophie's heart, which had been pounding in her chest with fear, began to calm. Confusion replaced the terror. What was this wolf doing? Why wasn't it attacking her? The wolf stepped back and turned its head, glancing over its shoulder as though inviting her to follow. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She didn't know if she should trust the animal, but something in the wolf's gaze, something almost familiar, almost warm, made her hesitate. She stepped forward, unsure, but trusting the wolf instinctively. The creature's tail swayed gently as it moved ahead of her, its steps sure and steady in the deepening snow. Sophie's feet slipped behind it, her small legs struggling to keep up, but she couldn't help but feel a strange sense of peace wash over her. She felt the fear of the storm, the panic of being lost, slowly slip away as the wolf led her through the blizzard. With each step, it felt like the storm lessened, the winds becoming less biting, and the snow not quite as heavy. It was as if the wolf knew exactly where it was going, guiding Sophie through the swirling chaos with a calm and grace that seemed impossible in such a fierce storm. She could hear the crunch of snow beneath the wolf's paws, each step measured and purposeful. It was as though the storm didn't matter to the creature. It simply knew the way. Sophie, her breath labored from the effort of trudging behind, glanced at the wolf's silhouette in front of her. The creature moved with an eerie confidence, as though it had done this countless times before. Sophie's legs ached, and her small feet slipped in the snow, but the sense of dread that had consumed her moments ago seemed to dissipate. The wolf, despite its wild appearance, was leading her somewhere safe. Eventually, after what felt like hours, they reached a small clearing in the woods. The storm had finally passed, and the sky above was beginning to clear. Sophie stood still, blinking against the sudden calm, her breath visible in the cold air. She felt as though she had been walking forever, the weight of the snow and the biting wind now replaced by an eerie stillness. Her body ached. Every step had felt like an eternity, but as she looked around, there was something strangely familiar about this place. Her eyes were blurry from the cold and the snow, but she squinted, trying to make sense of it. And then, through the trees just beyond the clearing, she saw it, a faint outline of a house. Her heart leapt in her chest. Her home. She was so close now, closer than she had imagined possible in the freezing wilderness. She could see the shape of the cabin, nestled within the woods, and the distant glow of light coming from the windows. It was almost too much to comprehend. Tears welled up in Sophie's eyes as she looked down at the wolf. It stood at the edge of the clearing, still and watchful, its eyes reflecting the soft glow of the clearing. Sophie's breath caught in her throat, overwhelmed with gratitude. The wolf hadn't just led her through the storm, it had brought her back home, back to safety. "Thank you," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling with exhaustion and emotion. She wanted to say more, to somehow express the depth of her thanks, but the words caught in her throat. Her body felt heavy with weariness, but her heart was lighter than it had been in hours. And then, something strange happened. The wolf, which had been so calm, so protective, seemed to shimmer. Its fur caught the light, almost as if the creature itself were made of mist or smoke. Sophie blinked, not sure if it was the cold playing tricks on her, but before she could make sense of it, the wolf was gone. One moment it was standing there, watching her with its piercing eyes, and the next, it had vanished without a trace. Sophie rubbed her eyes in disbelief, unsure if the exhaustion had gotten the better of her or if it had really happened. She searched the clearing, her heart racing. There was nothing, no footprints in the snow, no sign of the creature at all. The only evidence of the wolf was the deep, unshakable feeling of safety it had left behind. Sophie stumbled forward, her legs finally giving way beneath her. She collapsed into the snow, the cold creeping into her bones, but she didn't care. Her legs, worn and stiff, simply couldn't carry her any longer. She had made it. She was home. Moments later, her parents found her. They rushed to her side, panic in their eyes. Sophie could see the worry on their faces as they wrapped her in blankets, their arms pulling her close, trying to bring warmth back into her small, frozen body. They carried her back to the cabin, where the warmth of the fire seemed to melt the coldness from her limbs. Despite the exhaustion, despite the chill that still clung to her skin, Sophie couldn't contain the excitement in her voice. She was home, safe, and she had a story to tell. She recounted everything, the blizzard, the wolf, how it had led her through the storm. Her voice trembled as she spoke, and she could see the wonder in her parents' eyes as they listened. But then, as she finished, they exchanged uneasy glances. Sophie couldn't quite understand why their expressions shifted. There was doubt in their eyes, uncertainty. They didn't believe her. They weren't sure if they could. The next morning, after the storm had passed and the world had returned to a fragile calm, a group of townspeople set out to search the woods. They combed through the snow, their eyes scanning every inch of the forest. But despite their efforts, they found nothing. No sign of the wolf, no paw prints, no fur or evidence that an animal had been there at all. But then, as they reached the small clearing near Sophie's home, something caught their attention. A strange, large paw print, unlike any they had ever seen before. It was enormous, nearly twice the size of a normal wolf's print. They followed it, one print after another, until the trail led them to a cliffside overlooking the forest. There, beneath the fresh blanket of snow, something more unexpected was found. A small, unmarked grave. The headstone was simple, just a single inscription, faint and worn by time. A guardian remembered. The townsfolk were baffled. No one had known about the grave. It had been there for years, hidden beneath the snow, and yet no one had ever spoken of it. It seemed like the mystery of the wolf had deepened rather than resolved. But Sophie, from the warmth of her home, suddenly understood. The wolf hadn't just saved her. It had guided her through the storm, leading her not only back to her home, but to something far deeper. It was as if the wolf had been waiting for her, patiently watching over the forest, ready to step in when it was most needed. She never spoke of the wolf again. But years later, when Sophie had grown older and began working in the town's archives, she stumbled upon an old, forgotten story in the town's history. It was the tale of a man who had been lost in the snow many years before, a man known for his deep connection with the wilderness. The legend said that when the man died, he was buried secretly, and that in death, he became the guardian of the forest, a spirit in the form of a wolf. The realization hit Sophie like a thunderclap. The wolf that had saved her wasn't just any animal. It was the spirit of that man, transformed, still watching over Wintervale. And though no one would ever fully understand the truth, Sophie knew, deep in her heart, that the wolf had come for her when she needed it most, not only as a protector, but as something more, a guardian whose identity would forever remain a mystery. The town would never know the full story. But for Sophie, the wolf's act of kindness and its identity would remain an enduring miracle, something that would stay with her forever.